it's lovely to see you all. I have done some things with the sub-35s. They let me in sometimes to talk or do some teaching, which is great. So I'm really grateful to Sian for asking me to introduce Atula. And she asked me because I am a very good friend of Atula's. So Atula and I have been friends for 40 years. It's a very long time, isn't it? And I think friendship is such an important part of our life, our human life, isn't it? Such a gift to have friends. So to have long-standing friends is absolutely wonderful. So Atula and I were sub-35 Buddhists in our day. We know what it's like. We sort of remember. And so yes, I came along to Sri Lanka when I was just 24. I was ordained when I was 27. And I was co-running and teaching at the old North London Centre. And I was doing that, and one day Atula turned up. And we made a connection and we made friends. So yeah, I've known Atula a long time, and all that involves being a friend of someone for such a long time. We've done so many things together, taught together, done groups together, retreats together. We did a lot of those early, I think, retreats, LBC winter retreats that you had at Sibford up until recently. A lot of those. So many, many things we've done together as friends. When Atula came along, he was a builder. He had his own building company, and he was a very skilled carpenter. And we were young, we had no money individually and no money collectively, but we needed centres, we needed retreat centres, we needed places to live, and so we tried to get those sort of things together on that kind of basis. And Atula was often the only person with any kind of skill. I'm sure he's going to tell you what that was like. I put in all the sash cords upstairs in Sukhavati, actually. I want you to know that under Atula's direction, which was, we just do it like this. Anyway, I learned how to put sash cords in. So he was a builder, and he's had a lot to do with creating this facility here, which I hope he's going to tell you a little bit about, and other places, particularly Vajraloka and other places. But after a lot of that, he decided to sort of change tack. He's always been a reader. If you go around to have a cup of tea with Atula, as I often do, the place is littered with books, fascinating books. And he decided to go and study. So he studied at what was then, I think, the North London Poly. He studied literature, and particularly Greek literature. And he has a very strong love and interest in literature, and particularly in myth and legend. And then, you know, the significance of myth in our own depth and our own lives. And he pursued that by taking a psychosynthesis training. So, you know, you can see his kind of trajectory, really following something that he really loved and was really deeply interested in. And that's led him to be an enormous resource in this community around here, in the movement, as a friend, because I think he's really interested in what makes people tick deep down, not up here, but deep down. And that kind of interest and that passion in his individual work, in his group work, in his retreats, and in his friendships, and I've experienced this, is it enables people, me, to, you know, contact those depths and open up. So very, very transformative effect on individuals, on friends, and on this community. So fascinated to hear what he's going to talk about. You never know with Atula. Can't remember the title. I think it's something like, if you change, the countenance of the world changes. So Atula.
Good evening. I was just saying at Dhammadinna, I feel beyond my sell-by date, so really. I was reading Jung's Red Book the other day, and is where I got the title from. So a passage leapt out at me, so I'm going to read it twice. I'm not really going to make too many comments on it, but it just did leap out and seemed to have a relevance to those early years. So I'll read it twice before we get into it. I think it's somewhere, just let it wash over you. The meanings that follow one another do not lie in things, but lie in you, who are the subject to many changes insofar that you take part in life. Things also change, but do not change. But if you do change, then the countenance of the world alters. The manifold sense of things is your manifold sense. It is useless to fathom it in things. You got that? Yeah. The meanings that follow one another do not lie in things, but lie in you, who are subject to many changes insofar that you take part in life. Things also change, but do not change. But if you do change, then the countenance of the world alters. The manifold sense of things is your manifold sense. It is useless to fathom it in things. I kind of quoted that because I thought of, in a sense, I don't. My tendency has always been to try and keep out of life, and I feel that what I'm going to talk about is how I got dragged into it. And perhaps we need to really appreciate the context that gave birth to the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, as it then was named. It was the Western part which was very relevant then, for it was in the West, if not the rest of the world, that something very significant began to happen in the 60s. It was a time during which the war children were coming of age. In America, there was the beginnings of civil rights, the civil rights movement. There was also a sense of real rebellion building in young people in relationship to the war in Vietnam. I worked at Greek Street with deserters from Vietnam. I also worked with a woman that had who had come from America, who told me how she fled for her life from the police, which must have been quite a heavy thing. But she was in England for a while. So riots were occurring in campuses. The seeds that were growing in this anti-war movement finally broke out in expression of the music of flower power. There was an ingress of Eastern philosophy into the West. The martial arts, kung fu and all that, acid trips and drug taking, Ram Dass, the Beatles and of course Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were just some of the aspects of this opening up. Set against this was a clear opposition coming in the form of Russia and China, in particular the assassination of President John Kennedy and later his brother Robert. Then there was the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, which certainly had a significant impact on my life. In Britain, there was the rise of anti-racism, with demonstrations against the National Front and the River of Blood speech by Enoch Powell. Protests broke out here against the war in Vietnam itself, while on the political side, feminism appeared to be gaining a stronger voice. This opening and expansion particularly was happening in the middle classes. They were beginning to emerge from the dearth of the post-war years. Young people were finding an adventure, a new kind of lifestyle that was more communal. Squatting became a widespread phenomenon, owing to the availability of many derelict buildings and not too many rules. Most of all, there was a sense of possibility and hope. You could say into this came the Elvis Presley of Buddhism. You remember the beginning of the musical career of Elvis Presley took the music of the black musicians and made it accessible to young white America. In the same way, the Venerable Sangharakshita brought his very considerable understanding of the Dharma and made it accessible to his eager audience. The response from young idealistic people was phenomenal. It was to change a derelict area of Archway into a thriving community that was then to spread out to here, Bethnal Green. If you were searching for something other in your life, then you could not help but be drawn into it by the enthusiasm that had been generated for a new centre. Anything seemed possible. There was a sense of a purpose and community and plenty of vegetables. So, this is where I entered. I have been attending the centre in Archway, as Dhammadinna was saying, at irregular times at that time. To start with, as I was working in a homeless shelter in Soho. Gradually, I got drawn in via the enthusiasm for finding a new urban centre. There was this possibility of an old fire station in Bethnal Green, here. Negotiations had been proceeding between representatives of the GLC. God love them. There should be a plaque up here to the GLC. We owe so much to it. And Subhuti and Nagabodhi, so it was between the GLC. I think Subhuti and Nagabodhi, it might have been some others, but mainly those two, I think. Somehow they had managed to persuade the GLC that we could renovate this place into a centre. But that's a story better told by those involved in those negotiations. They would say that they had completely seduced the GLC into believing what they said. I think the GLC most likely wanted it off their hands, really. I think it was a choice between us and our arts community, and I think it would have meant that there would have to be grants given to the arts community, whereas we were foolish enough to suggest that we were going to be able to do it from our own resources. Over a period leading to the go-ahead, there have been a number of meetings with Subhuti, leading the way as he has a wont to do. Also at those first meetings were Punya, who you'll hear more about, Surita, Karmasila, Dipankara, most of them wouldn't have been ordained at that time, and others who I'm struggling to remember. There was a gradual defining of terms, an inclusion and exclusion, as it were. Originally, the idea was that there would be two communities, a men's and a women's, with the centre below. That was the vision that attracted me, and that was the vision I signed up for, as it were. I'll never forget the first time I ever saw this building. Jesus. If you can imagine it, this is there was two great big doors there. This had been where the fire engines would have sat. That corner there was a fire pole there was a fire pole. It ran right the way through here. These are two big piers that hold the central weight of the building, so they became a problem to us. The whole place, the whole ground floor and first floor was burnt out. Had been burnt out by the children who used it as their playground and really resented us coming in. It was dark, it was damp, there was corrugated iron all over the place, and the back end was just completely rotten, falling apart. I remember going home that night and saying to my friend, they really don't know what they're getting into, to which he left a very measured silence, looked at me square in the eye and said, and I suppose you do you? Fair cop. Yeah. So there was a lot of, I don't think you can sort of get, I think you can get a sense of it if you go on retreat. I think perhaps the nearest I can kind of think is at the end of a open retreat where they had the final puja and the enthusiasm that's there, and there was a great deal of that at that time. So on August the 5th, 1975, a number of us travelled over from the Archway Centre in the old purple van, which should be enshrined. How many times we ended up pushing that bloody thing? Yeah. So, we had permission to enter the premises, or so we thought, for within minutes of climbing the gates, a squad of policemen, preceded by a fallen truncheon, followed us over. There had been a breakdown in communication somewhere between the powers that be and the police. All they knew was that there was a gang of hippies moving in to squat the fire station. So that was our first hour. It took some time to persuade them, but with a cup of tea, anything can happen. So the first people that I think spent that first night were, I think probably Punya, who would then be Graham, Fridaya, Surita, Dipankara, Subhuti, Vimlamitra. I expect they're all names that you don't really know, but just they are some of the characters that took it on. There was no resources, there was no electricity, gas, water or anything. We were to be living and working in what was to all extent and purpose a derelict building. For the time being, in the summer it was fine, but as we got towards winter it was another matter altogether. The first job was a real clear out and begin to repair the roofs at the back. So the first couple of months was the honeymoon period of this centre. The enthusiasm was unbounded. The community from Archway and many friends from all over London would regularly come to help on the weekends. We would start on those weekends with a meditation, dish out the workload for the day, which Dhammadinna was talking about, ending up doing Sashkot, which was mainly getting all the rubbish out of the place. There was much enthusiasm, but not much skill on offer. But for the time being, that seemed to carry us along fine. Then the shit hit the fan, as it were. We discovered dry rot. I don't know if anyone's had any kind of experience of dry rot. Wet rot is easy enough to deal with, but dry rot gets into the brickwork, and it's like a cancer really. It spreads all over the brickwork. It eats into brickwork and completely eats the wood away. But it travels, and it had travelled in this building. So we were up on the far corner of the building, what used to be a toilet block, I think, but we started to uncover dry rot, as it were. The whole roof had been eaten away, and not only that, the corner hip of the main building was also beginning to really infect it. So, in those moments, I suppose some way I was the only one that really knew the extent of what it meant, really. All of a sudden there was a great big barrier. We were facing a different ball game altogether. Then enters Subhuti. He's coming from a convention full of, like he does, full of energy, full of enthusiasm, full of vision, as it were, and then he's met by me telling him this news. So immediately he wants to know how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, how much it's going to cost. Of course, I didn't have a bloody clue. But I think because I was an old grouse, pessimistic to the core, I think he just saw me as a block to his vision. And he got hold of my neck, and I'm up against the corner with his hands around my neck. So I've reflected about this moment quite a lot over the years. It certainly was a very significant moment in terms of the project. I imagine it in terms of Subhuti identifying with all his enthusiasm and optimism of the project, only to be confronted by what appeared a barrier to all the ambitions that he was carrying along. Here was I, relatively pessimist, old grouse, delivering him with a venomous message. From here on it was going to be a very different ball game altogether. We were going to have to find things in ourselves and in the community that we wouldn't have known that we had. Were we up to it? Perhaps both of us had taken on a very foolish identification. Subhuti through thinking he could do it all with vision, and me thinking I could do it with a hammer and saw. In that moment something had to give, and momentarily it was my neck. The implications were huge for us. It was if we had very little resources. In fact, we had none. It was all done on kind of enthusiasm. I think we have £15,000, or we did have. That was when we started, but already by this time we would have eaten into a lot of it. Although we've only been, all those on support were only about £2.50 at that time. It still meant there was the upkeep of the community, the living day to day. So it was a big pull on the whole project. So this discovery meant we were going to have to dig much deeper, not only in terms of funds, but also into our own resources for the task. But Dhammadinna would be back in Archway, and also Lokamitra. They were, I think, trying to do what they could to raise money still, but it was kind of quite yeah. And so Punya was a young man of 21 at that time, a very wiry character. He was in flight from a banking father and an entrepreneurial, is that you say, entrepreneurial brother. And I think he would have wanted to separate himself out completely from them, but he dearly loved his mother. And Punya was, I don't know, trouble is you'd say a lot about Punya, but I think the thing that you'd say most about him, he really loved Clint Eastwood movies. And when he walked, you could see Clint Eastwood in him, big. And he went about things in that way. And I remember him once telling me, he said with great authority that the greatest Western made was Once Upon a Time in the West. And he could talk at great length for 20 minutes about that opening sequence. If you've seen the film, every detail of it, he'd relay to you. And one of the things that there was another chap that came along, Robert, who came to us, American. Robert was very particular, and I sometimes would take slow, and he would say to him, "Do you know that scene in the Outlaw Josie Wales, where the Yankee soldiers are coming along the boardwalk, and there's Clint Eastwood carrying the groceries, and he looks at the Yankee, he says, 'You're going to use that thing or whistle Dixie?'" And that was, I was saying, Punya was always saying this to Robert to wind him up. Yeah. So it was Punya that took on the research for the dry rock, coming back to, we were going to have to strip all the plaster back, burn away any of the infected wood, drill thousands of holes in the brickwork, and inject a spray into the brickwork. Also, all the timbers in the roof everywhere would have to be sprayed, although he had protective clothing. But nevertheless, he exposed himself to quite considerable fumes for a number of months. And I wonder, because he died 5 years ago, I wonder to what extent that had contributory to his death. He was a heroic character. So the job itself of fixing the roof, we were going to need a scaffold. And again, we had no resources, so we ended up using the scaffold, or what's called a scaffold, from the community from Archway. We'd have to have a scaffold right up the outside of the building, the corner of the building, in order to be able to get at the roof and to do the hip. And that meant so we was going to have a scaffold up the side, and somehow we was going to have to hold the roof in kind of hovering for a while. So there was quite a lot to think about, and I think at that time I wish my father was still around. He had died the year before, and I think he would have relished the opportunity to come and help. But I really missed him at that point. So there we was, putting this scaffold up the edge of the Meccano set of a scaffold, and it was incongruous really. On the one end there was Robert holding on for dear life onto the pole, which I put him up, and then on the other there was Gitari balancing like a trapeze artist on the top. So it was crazy. But it meant that the authorities got interested in us. So I think the town surveyor the local surveyor must have been coming along what he did was coming on, and he saw what was happening, and he just went completely crazy. And from then on, he did not take his beady eye off us. We just invited his kind of authority, and he would make sure that any move we made, he would be there. And on top of that, some bright spark thought, wouldn't it be great to have the 3 jewels on the 3 gables up the top, the front of the building? And him I would have gradually throttled myself. So in the weeks following the discovery of dry rot, I found myself walking around in a kind of daze really, because there was all this plaster being taken off the walls. All it was being stripped off, and I kept looking at it, and I thought, someone's going to have to do the plastering, and who's going to do it, you know? And in the end, if in my apprenticeship, I'd often, like you do, kind of, muck around with other trades, things, and so did a little bit of plastering, and also bricklaying, apart from carpentry and joinery. But this was a different thing altogether. So one day I couldn't bear the tension anymore, and I said to Ratnapani, let's go down to Bartlett's, and we got a load of plaster. We came back, and we both of us that afternoon began to basically sort of teach ourselves, work out a way that we were going to go at it, and then as we become more proficient, then we began to teach other people. So that's how it went. So the wall of the dining room was the first wall we ever plastered. And soon Robert was eager to learn plastering, and also later on punya. And then beyond that was even later than that, there was a chap called Guy Daggett, who again was another American, rather a tall young man, very shy. He had a kind of cleft lip, but he became quite proficient, and he did all this finishing. Well, I'm kind of very proud of him really, because he more or less, he he'd never done anything like that before, and I think he made a fantastic job of that. Anyway, there you go. And he wasn't interested in Buddhism. He became a Jungian analyst later on. And while he was here, he used to have dream workshops. So about that time, I go on. I could go on about these different things. I don't know whether it's going to interest you really, but any time over those years, there would be about 25 people living upstairs, in Sukhavati, as it was named, Buddhaland. Some worked in the office that was set up. It became the central office of the FWBO. And though many people came and went through those years, the core of our main workforce began to evolve. Chief amongst those, of course, was Punya, Robert, Ratnapani, Arya, Dipankara. So Arya became, he had some carpentry skills, but he mainly sort of took that on, and I taught him more, as much as I could. And chief amongst them was Punya, really. Punya and Robert. And the problem was with voluntary labour, which we were mainly dependent on, is that with voluntary labour you're free to come and you're free to go. And given that most of our volunteers had come from a kind of hippie lifestyle at that time, that's what happened most of the time. So you'd regularly find yourself bringing people up to a certain proficiency and teaching people to a certain level of skills and then losing them, as it were. Okay. I cannot remember the exact date, but I can remember the scaffold being still up early in 1976. And early that month, there was a Monday morning meeting. There was an announcement. And the announcement was informing us that it was no longer going to be a men's and women's community over the centre. The goalposts had been moved. The project was going to be a men's community above a public centre. That's it. No discussion, no dialogue. You can talk about it if you like, but that's how it's going to be. That's it. I was gobsmacked. It was a decision that I felt uncomfortable with and said as much to no avail. It left its mark. I was uncomfortable with the then, and still remains so today actually. It is an aspect of the so-called spiritual hierarchy I remain uncomfortable with. Although I dare say there is some of my working class socialist background breaking through, I still feel uncomfortable with a decision that had no recourse to the people who would have to deal with the day-to-day consequences of that decision. At such times it seemed to me, in retrospect, that the relational is sacrificed for the sake of the principle. Or as I heard it bandied about as a rationalisation, one sometimes has to sacrifice the good in order to attain the best. The good in this case being one half of the community who had helped in bringing the project about in the first place, was suddenly estranged, betrayed. You could argue that there did need to be a separation, but what was the fear in bringing it into some kind of dialogue with those it concerned? As it was, it split the community, and consequently it split the individuals concerned. A frosty and cold partition emerged, with antagonism breaking out between men and women. You may well ask how it was, feeling the way I didn't walk away. Somehow, I still held onto the vision of a centre as being part of that nucleus of a new society. I held on to that sense of serving community. How we were to manage the disappointment and other difficult feelings around this split in some ways is one of the untold stories of the Friends. The Archway Centre was finally pulled down. The women found a place in Wanstead and founded a community there, which is another story, but from the little I know, it was a very difficult time. Those who founded that community were Dhammadinna, Anoma, Sangadevi, Anjali, Anuttara, Vimla, Helen Johnson, Anne Farleman, and over those years many others, I suppose. Yeah. In the summer of 1976, we ran out of resources altogether. If we were going to complete this project, we had to find ways of finding funds. There was already a printing press down in the basement, run by Aramita and Prakasha. Friends Food was created, which we fitted out accordingly to Devaraja's design in the front. Had the food shop where the reception is now. There was the haulage business, which was solely manned by Vimla Mitra. It was a disaster, owing to the unreliability of the van. And poor old Vimla Mitra, I don't think there was a job that he went out on that he didn't break down on. And I think there was something about Vimla. He was a failed playboy, really. And everything seemed to go against him at that time. Yeah. So, and finally we created Friends Building. At first we worked on contracts in the movement, such as the newly blossoming Norwich Sangha. We travelled up there to knock two buildings together as their new centre. We also fitted out a restaurant for them. And of course it was become necessary to open a meditation club because it had all become very internalised. And the idea was we needed to start teaching again. So the meditation club was founded down 119 Roman Road, which we now know, or we did know as Bodywise. So that was sometime in beginning of 77, I think. In 1977, we completed a number of building contracts, travelling in all areas across London every day for various jobs. All the work had been completely come to a halt in the community, and we were unable to do any work on the new centre. It remained in a derelict state, mainly used as a store for building materials and whatever local sharks had convinced the booty we needed. The least said, the better, really. It was amazing what we ended up chucking out in the end. We were running fast just to stand still. Sometimes it seemed the left hand didn't know quite what the right hand was doing. At some point, Blanty had propositioned Robert, which meant we lost Robert. He didn't leave, but he was no longer as available to what we needed from him. He became much more conditional in what he would do. It's a situation that we all face with at some point in our life. That is when the human being or the institution doesn't quite marry up to our ideals and expectations. Under it all, Robert was very idealistic. And at that time was not ready to let go of those idealistic expectations of the other, which was very painful for him and painful for me, as I really appreciated his contribution. Then again, one evening, we returned from being out on a contract in South London. I went to the office and was told that Bhante had taken Kulananda back to Padmaloka. I was stunned, speechless. We had just got Kulananda to the point where we could leave him on a job to do first fixings in plumbing. And I stood there for a while and I went, why? And I finally stumbled it out of me. And because the answer came from Subhuti, because Bhante thinks he is too sensitive to stay here. I remember standing in the centre of the office, totally, my shoulders were rounded enough. I was downcast, usually, slumped even more, looking down at the floor. And finally I burst out in a whiny, pathetic voice, but aren't I sensitive too? And then, on top of that, 1977 was a horrible, horrible year. On top of all that horror of horrors, we lost Punya. We had secured a contract in Streatham, South London. The job was to rip out the hallway floor and staircase, which was riddled with rot. Make and install a floor and staircase and put in a new door. Alia and myself made the staircase in our workshop, while Punya and myself did the site work, which meant treating the rot, replacing the hallway floor, putting the staircase up, and finally hanging the new front door. Having completed the work late one evening, I left Punya to finish off the priming on the front door. I probably had to go to another job or something. Big mistake. That evening we lost him to the arms of a woman. The lady of the house had seduced him. Although I don't think she had to work too hard. He was, and he become totally besotted by her. The experience opened him up in all those parts of himself that other lagas just could not reach. It's an experience that we can all recognise. That is, that we cannot override certain needs with impunity. Or to put it another way, Eros will have his say, his way. So taken was he that he was willing to risk all and decided to leave the community and go out into the world. I cannot begin to express and put into words my feelings. I had lived in the same room, worked, and been in a very intense context with Punya for over 2 years. I valued him and deeply loved that man. I was going to miss not only his incredible capacity for grueling work, but also his honest companionship. There was nothing flamboyant about Punya. He just was there. It was a big blow for me, but also for the community. By the end of 1977, things looked very bleak indeed. We had been working our butts off, only to be told we had just about broken even. As I've said, work had come to a total standstill in the community. It was now livable, but it still needed a lot of work to be comfortable living space. And I suppose that didn't really happen until much, much later. By that time, we still had not done anything to the ground floor. I must admit to feelings of despair of ever finishing the project. And then, miracle of miracles, Subhuti, through his diligent, skillful politicking, had managed to get our project accepted onto a manpower service scheme. It was a scheme initiated by the government to aid people getting back into work. The idea was that worthwhile social projects would be given grants. It was to be a cooperative venture between the GLC, God love them, and the local council. So the GLC, God love them, would pay the wages of the labour force, which would be drawn from the dole, and the local council would pay for the materials. All of a sudden, we had the possibility to work on the centre. We can't begin to explain the relief that brought to us. I managed to get, we'd have to get signed on. We'd have to go down the dole and sign on as unemployed in order to work on our own project. In the end, I managed to get employed as a foreman of this project. The wages, of course, went straight into the FWBO coffers. But we were going to have to convince the local council that our project was going to be beneficial to the community. Not an easy task at that time. Secondly, we were going to have to come up with a plan of the works and timetable. Thirdly, we were going to have to convince the unions that we were kosher. The first one would be Subhuti's responsibility. While God love us, I was going to have to come up with a works plan, which I've never done in my life, something I had never done at all. And then I was reeled out to try to pacify the union. I'd once been a card-carrying union member and could see what their concerns were. Were we going to be stepping over the boundaries of job descriptions, and were we up to the job? We had good talk. I had a good talk with them, and thankfully they were very impressed by the joinery at the front of the building. So we managed to get the go-ahead. I look back on the last 8 months. How are we doing for time? 9:30. Oh, not too bad. I look back on the last 8 months of 1977 as the most I was going to say creative, but I don't think I can claim that for myself. Certainly they were the most productive months of my life. In the daytime I was foreman of a very busy building site of about 20 workers of different levels of skill. In the evening after dinner I would come down and concentrate on those jobs that no one else could do without my close supervision. By this time, Alia had become quite a good joiner. He still lacked experience, but he was beginning to turn out some very good work. There's an example of it there, really. Well, this is an example of it. But there's an example of it there, and we would have had to hand do all those mouldings. So you can see it's quite good job. But I still needed to be working to do some of the more complex work. He still lacked that experience. Again, one noticed the enthusiasm for the projects which began to emerge again after all the vicissitudes of previous years. It was this enthusiasm that carried us along, enabling us to reach deeper into ourselves and find extra resources for the work. It was like a call and response. We also became the nucleus around which two other manpower projects revolved. Dipankar got the job as the foreman of the Four Corners, which is just along the road. It's now a hotel, but which is next door to 109 Roman Road. And there was also a project happening on Camera Works, which was the renovation of the ground floor of 119. And we were constantly called on for advice from those projects. As the work progressed, we became the hub of these three projects, ending up providing a soup kitchen in the dining room. And then that finally spilled over into running a soup kitchen in what was to become later on the first part of the cherry orchard, now the larder. But every day at lunch, and of course we have that first beginnings was run by Samatha. And every day at lunch there would be, at one time, between 20 to 30 people in the community dining room upstairs. The whole place was a hive of activity. For the last 2 months of the project, which was down to opening on the 28th of November, how we picked that out of the air, I don't know. We worked, so we was to do that, and we did it. We did finish it on the eve. But during those last 2 months, we worked all the hours that we possibly could. I suppose you could say during that time it was Crazyville, really. But gradually it all began to come together. We resolved the problem of the two big piers. These two big piers here. Because first of all, I think the idea was we wanted to try and have a whole shrine room going right the way through, but it just wasn't going to be possible. So we came up with this idea of having two shrine rooms. So this is a 4 foot square pier, 2 4 foot square piers, which was very difficult to do anything with. Yeah. And at the same time we managed to resolve getting some kind of air conditioning at that time. And for that, Sona, who was an engineer, heating engineer, came down. But we ended up making a lot of the... not as though you really want to know all about that, would you? So the last evening before the opening, we were still working at midnight. Alia was putting the last touches to the plinth for the Buddha. Alaka, an artist, was working on the lotus in the front here. While Chintamani was downstairs putting the finishing touches on the Buddha, which he was still working on in the basement, and he was fighting. He fought to the dear end not to let go of it. He would. In the end, we had to take it off him and draw it up. And poor man, he stood there. He'd been working on it for 3 years. So there's that one, there's this one and the one next door. And he made copy after copy after copy. And finally, we had to try and drag it off him. There was a kind of thing that, well, don't want to get into that really, but it was funny that there was a week's celebration after we come, and still when we started that week's long cell, the Buddha was not up here, and more or less as because people were going to meditate in this room all the week, and in the end we had to get 2 scaffold poles up there, and while everyone was meditating we were gradually inching the Buddha up. But it was like that madness. And that's Chintamani. And of course the painters under Jyotipala's, who we dragged in supervision, were applying the finishing touches to the shrine room. Well, spread out at the back of the room was the curtains that had been fitted, and I was trying to work out who was doing that. It was I can't remember. And in the front here, besides both shrine room, was these 2 hangings, which, under the inspiration of Anjali and a number of women, they were putting the finishing touches to those hangings. It's as though the women had come in from the cold, and perhaps these hangings are a testament of the faith in the vision that they had kept through what can only be described as torrid and difficult times. And I think it's significant they are both hung, both sides of the Buddha, attached to 2 load-bearing piers. Just as the piers bear the central weight of the building, it is the image of the lotuses that carry the thrust of the Buddha's first vision that inspired him to go forth and teach. Like the pillars of our Hercules. And how have those splits been resolved in the community? One could say it's still a work in progress. I remember building an image in my own mind based on Bante's insistent being on the going for refuge, as he said at one point, you can take everything away that I've taught, but keep the going for refuge. And I remember kind of building my own mind a 2-dimensional image. It had a vertical perspective reaching from history to a vision of the Buddha, crossed by what I call the regressive factors of my personality. Those reactive and defensive patterns that work against the vertical perspective. At any given time, that's what we're struggling with. To try and keep a vision, one has to be working with those regressive factors in one's personality. And if I put a circle around this intersection, then I've got a cross, but it's a cross. It's like the material cross, isn't it? But in a sense, it's that intersection which I would identify as what we would call, although I don't like the word, spiritual life. We are always working in that perspective of the vertical, the vision, from history to the vision, and we're always working to somehow clear the the duality, the kind of the different regressive factors that blind us, or shut out that vertical vision perspective. That makes sense, do you? Yeah. And it's that intersection that I felt contrary to spiritual life, or as Bhante called it, active, going for refuge, where one is both aware of the vertical perspective, as it were, and the repressive factors of our experience. Or as Jung put it in his book Sermons to the Dead, nothing can truly be resolved within the pleroma, which he means by that duality. The wise man keeps his eyes on the distant star. The splits can't be resolved by reactivity or taking sides. We have to find a way to take responsibility for our own understanding of the whole vision, other than a part of it, which means going beyond polarity and human hierarchies to the potential vision within ourselves that is embodied in the figure of the Buddha and these hangings. A constant reminder of the potential of Sangha to heal the historical splits that we experience and renew a sense of community that unites us. Thank you.
Many things I could say, different approaches I could take. Just to sum up very quickly, the first one is blood, sweat and tears. So you walk into this building, I still walk into this building and take it for granted as it is, even though I was here back then. Beautiful building. I've had some work done on it in the last few years, but every aspect of this building, every piece of wood, every light fitting, every bit of plaster, everything in this building was created by the hands of the people, those people back then who didn't know what they were doing. Atula did and didn't have the money to do it. So it's a fantastic story, isn't it, of the ups and downs of all that. And you know what has blossomed out of that, not just the building, but what the building enables to happen, which is the community that has come here over all those years and still comes here. So history is interesting. Someone was saying to me the other day that we need to keep telling our stories, and I was thinking, I get fed up with talking about the past personally. I can't remember it so clearly anymore. And there's so much happening in the present, but and history is very important, isn't it? Kind of because it's just interesting to know where things come from collectively. And this centre is not in the modern sense, is it? It's not a pop-up. It didn't. Pop-ups are great, aren't they? But it didn't just pop out of nothing. You can tell. This is just a very small part of the story that where it grew from. So, having a sense of our history, individual and collective, it kind of links us in, doesn't it? It connects us much more strongly together, and we have a sense of the community that's brought us to this point, and I think we have a very living, and you've done that tonight, a very living sense of the teaching of conditionality. Conditionality isn't an abstract intellectual teaching that everything arises in dependence on conditions. That's what we heard tonight. Every brick, every stone, every whatever has arisen in dependence on conditions, co-created by a number of people, Atula of whom was one of the main ones. And that kind of touches us, doesn't it? Well, it touches me. It kind of means something. The Dharma as truth, that truth of conditionality then kind of comes right into relationship with us. And, our task then is to keep that whole process going and take our history into the future. And as you're all, most of you sub 35, that's your job.